Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's Bomb Magazine's Room with a View. I'm Benjamin Samuel, Bomb's managing editor, and I'm honored to be moderating tonight's event with Lilly Dancyger, Melissa Febos, and Forsyth Harmon. In case you're not already familiar with Bomb Magazine, we were founded in 1981, and we've been delivering the voices of iconic visual and performing artists and writers for 40 years. Tonight's spectacular writers have all been featured in Bomb. You can read excerpts from Lilly's memoir and Forsyth novel on our website. And Melissa also has an incredible interview in Bomb's latest issue. We'll place links to all of those in the chat, as well as links to buy their books. So this event will include a reading by each of our authors, as well as a moderated discussion with questions primarily written by the authors. And then we'll have a Q&A with you, our audience. And at any time, you can post a question for our authors using the question feature at the bottom of your screen. You can also post comments in the chat throughout the event. So feel free to say hello, let us know where you're watching from, and chime in throughout the event. So now it is my pleasure to briefly introduce tonight's authors, because I'm sure you're all much more excited to see them and get on with the evening than hear me yammering away. So Lilly Dancyger is a contributing editor at Catapult, assistant editor at Barrel House Books, and the editor of the anthology Burn It Down, Women Writing About Anger. She's the author of the forthcoming memoir, Negative Space, which was selected by Carmen Maria Machado as one of the winners of the Santa Fe Writers Project Literary Awards. Melissa Febos is the author of Whip Smart and two essay collections, Abandon Me and Girlhood. She is the inaugural winner of the Jean Cordova Nonfiction Award from Lambda Literary and the recipient of numerous fellowships, including from the McDowell Colony and Breadloaf. Melissa is an associate professor at the University of Iowa, where she teaches in the nonfiction writing program. And Forsyth Harmon is the author and illustrator of Justine and the illustrator of Melissa Febos's Girlhood and Catherine Lacey's The Art of the Affair. Focused on literary illustration, her work has been featured in The Believer, Tin House, Virginia Quarterly Review, and The All. She received both her BA and MFA from Columbia University. And now, without any further ado, let's bring on our first author.
Hi. Thanks so much for having us, Ben, Josh, Libby, Bomb. I'm really excited to be here reading with Forsyth and Melissa. I'm just going to read a really short passage from early on in Negative Space that speaks to the relationship between the images that appear throughout and the story. I don't think you need any background, so I'm just going to jump in. Some people grow up with religious iconography. I grew up with my father's art. Instead of saints or crosses or scrolls, I had dogs, deer, rabbits, and the female form. Deer with human hands for antlers, dogs leaping into space, rabbits in targets, rabbits in burrows, rabbits in the sky. They were my sacred images, created by the dirty, calloused hands of my alchemist father. I learned the language and stories of my father's art before I learned nursery rhymes. I knew that the women he drew were my mother, and that he drew her because he loved her and couldn't believe how beautiful she was. I knew the deer and dogs and rabbits were him, that the hands he sculpted were modeled after his own hands. I learned to draw by copying his drawings, learned to work clay by playing with his discarded scraps. I learned to understand the world around me by trying to recognize what my father might think was beautiful. Understanding that every walk we took was a scavenger hunt, and that anything could be sculpture material. Everyone inherits their parents' stories, their baggage, the symbols through which they interpret life, but perhaps this is especially true and inescapable for the children of artists, who are steeped in it and surrounded in it in such a literal sense, growing up in homes decorated with tangible pieces of our parents' psyches externalized. In his copy of The Language of Fire, a collection of literary criticism by Maurice Blanchot, next to a line that claims that the written sentence can, quote, reduce the heaviness of things to the agility of signs. My father wrote in pencil, and sculpture? Whose business is the heaviness of things, or the heaviness of things as signs and agile? He was arguing in the marginalia that sculpture can turn life to symbols too, but it uses heaviness to do it, rather than resisting the heaviness of human existence, capturing our experiences and thoughts and emotions, bringing them down to the solid earth like a wild bird in a cage. All the intangible parts of him that I was so afraid to lose were right there, captured in the heaviness of his work. My father had left me the letter I wanted so badly after all. It was just in code. All I had to do was decipher it. I knew what some of his images represented, but I didn't know how they all fit together, how one led into the next, or exactly when he started each series. If I could figure out what was going on in his life when he made each piece, I thought, maybe I could read his sculptures like a story. Maybe I could almost hear my father's voice. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Passage from the book. I'm so glad to be here reading and talking with my two pals. And thank you to all the folks at BOM for setting this up. I'm going to read just a couple pages from Girlhood, from the essay that at least part of the image that you see here is from. It's an essay called Wild America. And it's about what a weird, savage little vegetarian child I was. Before I learned about beauty, I delighted in my body. I was a passionate child with calloused feet and lots of words. I talked fast and moved faster, through the woods around our Cape Cod home, up trees, and into the ocean's crashing surf. Finely tuned to the swells of my own and others' hearts, I sensed a deep well at my center, a kind of umbilical cord that linked me to a roiling infinity of knowledge and pathos that underlay the trivia of our daily lives. Its channel was not always open, and what opened it was not always predictable. Often songs and poems, a shaft of late afternoon light, an unexpected pool of memory, the coo of doves at dusk whose knell ached my own throat and seemed the cry of loneliness itself. It was often possible to open the channel by will, an option that I found both terrifying and irresistible. I would read or think or feel myself into a brimming state, not joy or sorrow, but some apex of their intersection, the raw matter from which each was made, then lie my back to the ground, body vibrating, heart thudding, mind foaming, thrilled and afraid that I might combust, might simply die of feeling too much. My mother had raised me vegetarian, and though I harbored no real desire to eat meat, sometimes in summer I would take a hunk of watermelon to a remote corner of our yard and pretend it was a fresh carcass. On all fours, I would bury my face in the sweet red fruit meat and tear away mouthfuls. Sometimes I'd rip handfuls out and cram them between my teeth, which wasn't much like any animal I knew of. It was less playing a particular kind of animal than enacting a form of wildness that I recognized in myself, but that had no appropriate expression in human culture. I watched Wild America along with the more savage nature specials on public television and thought, maybe. Maybe no one else recognized themselves in the hyena's blood-soaked grin, her ruthless hunger. Maybe no one else's heart raced, fists clenched, neck tensed, unable to tell if she was more impala or lion. Well, I did. Alone in the woods behind our house, I had beaten my chest, acted out my own invented stories without a thought to how another's gaze might see me. I sympathized with the jittery business of squirrels and fanatical obsessions of our golden retriever. I was confounded by silverware, why it should exist when we had such perfect instruments at the ends of our arms. Walt Whitman claimed our distinction from animals to be that they do not sweat and whine about their condition, and not one is dissatisfied, not one is demented with the mania of owning things. I learned in elementary school that we were animals, but unlike other animals, we did not seem driven by the instinct for physical survival. We were so far up the food chain that it was no longer even visible to us. We were beyond survival, in a dark and lofty realm wherein our obsolete instincts had been perverted into atrocities like capitalism and bikini waxing. I might not have been able to name this, but I recognized it. In elementary school, however, we kids were not making an ontological study of late 20th century middle-class American life. We were neither learning about capitalism nor reading Whitman. We were learning how to be human. We were learning the exact way in which, though we were animals, we should not look or act like them. To call someone an animal was an insult. As my peers and I approached puberty, this was unfortunate because I had trouble keeping track of the narrative. I was covered in scabs and bruises. I was sun-browned, full of size, and interested in every orifice. I was an animal. By middle school, this felt like an especially disgusting secret because I was also a girl. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily and Melissa. It's so great to be here with you. And also thanks, Baum, for doing such a gorgeous job at this event. And thanks so much to all of you. Really glad to be here with you tonight. I am going to read just a couple pages from Justine. I don't think any context is necessary. I opened the door. The room reeked of weed. Shut it behind you. Ryan lay on his bed watching real stories of the highway patrol. His floor was covered with shirts, socks, skateboards. A stack of Thrasher magazines spilled from a plastic laundry basket. Loose change was scattered everywhere. Pennies, nickels, even quarters, along with crumpled receipts, used up matchbooks, a couple of lighters, and so many roaches. I saw near my foot what was most likely a girl's black hair elastic, a few bobby pins. This episode's dope, he said, gesturing toward the TV. Calvin Johnson and Jug Marsh talked their way out of getting arrested for possession. He didn't want to get up from the bed. Your sister just dumped a gallon of gin into the kitchen sink. Yeah, Eileen hates when mom drinks, he said. Hepatocellular carcinoma. What? Liver cancer. Oh, sorry. I'd drink too if I was married to the lieutenant. His walls were lined with CDs and cassettes, organized with the precision of a retail display. I studied the spines. They were alphabetized. Black Rob, Black Sheep, Black Star, thousands of albums. Ice Cube, Ice T, Ill Bill, Ill Mind. I stumbled over a skateboard and sat down by him on the bed. His pillowcases didn't match his sheets. I felt something under my thigh. It was a book signifying rappers, rap and race in the urban present. I placed it toward the foot of the bed. He flipped through the channels. Stephen King got hit by a car? Wait, I said. Drew Barrymore walked along a dock with a fat man. Don't you know what this is? The Amy Fisher story. I think I heard Joey Buttafuoco's a wrestler now. Amy Fisher is a porn star. Really? He shrugged. I came for the tape. I have it, he said, then turned off the TV and looked at me. My body felt like it was boiling off. He stood, unbuckled his belt, and dropped his pants to the floor. His boxers were white with maroon stripes. He removed his shirt, and his torso was pale, ropey, and all cut up. I mean everywhere. Cuts striping the insides of his biceps, some raw, some scabby. I wanted to touch him. Something about the cuts made me realize I'd wanted to touch Ryan all this time. He was a real, naked person standing there, all cut up. Thank you.
Incredible to see all the comments that were coming up in the chat. Everyone was just so encouraging and supportive and frankly in awe. So thank you very much. Now I know you all kind of wrote questions for each other, and I'm gonna run through as many of those as we can get to before we transition to the audience Q&A. And just a reminder to everyone out there, please leave questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. All three of your books include visual elements. Forsyth, you illustrated two of them, your own and Melissa's. And Lilly, your book features your father's artwork. So can you talk about the relationship then between the visuals and the text, and what the visuals added that you think would be missing? Forsyth, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I love this question. Thank you. I've always drawn and wrote, and so, practically, as an artist, the two were inextricable for me. But when it came to this particular story, Justine, we're dealing with a teenage narrator who I would say struggles to communicate her feelings. We don't get a ton of interiority from her. She's not totally able to put into words her experiences and how they impact her. And so I looked at the illustrations as a kind of extension of her interiority. They're black and white, as you saw in the slideshow. And so, in that way, I think they reflect her sort of black and white thinking. They're also largely at very close range. I don't think she has a ton of perspective. But also, especially when I show a series of images, I hope that they do some of the work of emoting for her. So for instance, there's a scene when she starts to warm up to the title character, Justine, and we see a butterfly and a makeup compact opening. There's a kind of opening inside of her, and a willingness to participate in friendship. And in the passage that I read, which sort of continues to describe a confusing, intimate experience, you saw that I showed a kind of cassette tape unraveling. Yes, the cassette is an iconic object of the late 90s. And yes, Ali was going to this boy Ryan's house in order to pick up a cassette tape that he'd made for her. But at the same time, there's a kind of unraveling that happens for her, through this experience that I also hope to depict through illustration.
Great, thank you. Lilly and Melissa, do either one of you want to jump in?
You go, Melissa.
Okay. I'm going to lob this back to Forsyth probably also. But I will just say that I never imagined collaborating with anyone in terms of writing. And that's like one of the sort of principal safeties for me of writing, is that there was no one else involved. And so if I failed, there was no one to see me fail along the way. And if I failed ultimately, there would be no one else to blame, which I now realize is this like incredibly limited idea of the potential avenues for collaboration. Because I don't draw, I never imagined having visual images incorporated into my work. And it was for me, a really organic process where Forsyth and I became pals, and we collaborated on an early version of an essay that ended up in the book, but at that point wasn't. And it was so fun to watch the images from my own experience that I had then sort of redrawn in words, to see those emerge from someone else's imagination was just like mind-blowing. I'd never experienced it before. And so I like pretty much immediately went to my editor and was like, what if this brilliant person illustrates this whole book, fully expecting her to laugh me off the phone. And she was like, yeah, absolutely. And so, I could go on for a really long time about our collaboration process, and I would love Forsyth to talk a little bit more about that. But the thing that I feel like the images add, it's almost like a song. I've always been sort of jealous of musicians, the way that that form of art can bullseye a particular emotional truth, just like an arrow, like so quickly, instantly, without having to struggle to find words or build a cumulative narrative or whatever. It takes a long time to build the emotional reality of a piece of writing. And I love having Forsyth's illustrations as a kind of portal into the essay before you get there, that communicate instantly the combination of sort of like thorniness and vulnerability that I think the essays hopefully achieve by their end. But maybe Forsyth, you can talk a little bit more about how you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I started looking to illustrate writers' work also sort of as a way, maybe out of the solitude of writing and of drawing. And into, the minds of, some of the people I most admired. And illustrating Girlhood was so much fun and such a profound experience. And I've compared it to like sort of like sifting for gold, essentially, like looking for those images that are kind of iconic of the intentions of the essays, individually as frontispieces for each essay. But then, and I bring up the image of a constellation because it comes up often in the book, sort of looking across the 8 images, looking for a kind of a constellation of consistent visual language that then kind of represents as a set the intention of the book as a whole. And so, Melissa, I like what you said about the song. Like, it is sort of trying to create like a kind of a handle into the feeling of both the complete essay collection and each essay itself.
That's fascinating. I love the idea of sort of sifting for gold too. Such a nice way to think about it.
Although if you've read the collection, it's all gold, so it's very difficult to come up with the individual pieces, for sure.
Well, Lilly, I'm curious about your experience with it, because you were working from kind of like a set quantity of like a limited quantity of images. Can you talk about that experience?
Somewhat. I mean, yeah, there actually are way more images than what made it into the book. But of
course, yeah.
Talking about it as a collaboration, I felt very much that was what I was doing as well, even though, my father isn't here, but writing in response to his work, as opposed to, Forsyth, you're drawing in response to writing, and I was writing in response to images, but it's still this kind of circular back and forth conversation, which is really how I thought of it. And the images also kind of form their own storyline in the book. There already are 3 narrative threads in the written story, and that wasn't enough, so why not add a visual narrative thread as well, just to keep it really complicated. But the art really was my way into the story to begin with. I interviewed about 24 people who knew my father. I read his notebooks, I read letters, I read my mom's journals, but all of those things were giving me just pieces of the story, and most of them were other people's perspective on my father, their memories of him. And, even his notebooks were very technical. Most of them were about the work rather than about his life. So the art was the most direct line that I felt I could get to his internal life and to what he actually really felt and thought and how he saw the world, not just how other people saw him, right? Because there also was often a lot of conflict. People didn't always see him in the best light, even though he was very beloved. He also was troubled and caused a lot of trouble for a lot of people. And so the art was a way to get at him and at his character and his person and his story, his life, without that mediating factor of interpersonal conflict and bias and, talking to ex-girlfriends and, my mother's ex-wife, there of course is going to be a lot of shading in that. So yeah, I think of it very much as a collaboration also, but it also is very hard to collaborate with somebody who's not here, and making decisions about which pieces to include, especially when there were multiple versions of an image. There were a lot of pieces where there were several that were very similar, but I was somewhat limited to how many I could include, and I just had to fake the confidence to pick which one I thought he would want to include, even though that was difficult sometimes.
It was really amazing though, Lilly. I know we heard a lot about him from your experiences and others' experiences, but including those images, like I really felt like we were hearing his voice, and that he was able to also narrate, and it was just so beautiful. So it's brilliant that you included those.
Yeah, I wanted to also I think this is right, because you and I have, had many conversations about this book before now, but that you felt so certain way before you were even seeking publication that this was going to be part of the book, and like it was baked into the very foundational conception of the book that it was going to be this collaboration, and have those images felt like such a bold and I don't know, it just had a lot of integrity, that conception.
Thank you. Yeah, there were a couple points where, I might have been able to publish sooner if I had taken the images out, but that was just like, if I took the images out, the book wouldn't exist anymore. The whole thing would just collapse in on itself, and it would not be, it just wouldn't work. So, yeah.
And I think also that the fact that so many of those images were of his sculptures, and there's a way that you can really kind of see his fingerprints coming through. It's also worth pointing out that that's one of your father's pieces in the background there.
This little rabbit. This is a really delicate one that I love. It's paper mache, and these really delicate paper ears. And also it has this cigar box that he made as a case for it, with like tin foil built in to like hold it in place so that you can move it without the ears getting crushed, which is very cool.
Amazing. So, I mean, in addition to the visual element that all your books share, your books also deal, at least in part, with adolescence. And Lily, I think this is your question that you posed about how you each got into the sort of younger mindset to write those stories and inhabit that perspective. And in that process, what surprised or fascinated you about it? Melissa, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, yeah, this I could reply with the entire 320 pages of my book to this question. It's a great question. I think one of the sort of primary impetus for me writing this book was that I needed to go back to sort of correct the stories of that time that I had been telling myself in all of the intervening years. And so writing this book was absolutely, in every single essay, a process of revising, restoring, discovering what had actually happened and how it had affected me, like what the experience of my adolescence and my girlhood and my younger life had been. And I have a really sort of terrible memory, which is quite a burden for a memoirist. And so I did a lot of research. I have journals going back to when I was 9 and 10 years old. And I have go all the way up until the present, which is both sort of a tool for mental stability, and has been for my whole life, but it also functions really practically as an archive of my interior experiences, and sometimes an archive of my denial and sort of the cleanup job that I have psychically done on the truth of my experience. And I'll just give one example to finish. And this was it's the first full-length essay that appears in the collection. And in many ways, it was sort of the seedling from which the rest of the collection really grew. And it is this essay about this experience of bullying that I had in 5th grade, that I had really just sort of packed up, wrapped some duct tape around the shoebox and put it at the back of the closet of my consciousness, and been I was never bullied. That wasn't so bad, which is pretty much my line about everything that has ever happened to me. At least, that's my first answer. And I had this memory about it. I hadn't thought about it in decades. And I went back and found my journal from when I was 10, 11, 12. And I found a description of the experience in which I completely rewrote it to totally obscure the truth of it, where I basically described us as pals, me and this bully who totally tormented me and spat on me for a period of months. And it was this very particular combination of chilling kind of horror and also profound satisfaction, because of course that truth had been, I'd been carrying it all those years. And so to see the reality of that sort of cover-up job was deeply satisfying to the part of me that wanted to name it. And I thought, what the hell else is in there? What else have I sort of rewritten that I now have the resources to be able to tell a truer story of? And so that was really the engine that drove all the essays in this book.
Forsyth?
Yeah, I came to this book during what I now think of as a kind of second adolescence. I was going through a lot of life changes at the time. I'd ended a really long-term relationship. I'd moved across the country. I'd left a job. I was starting a master's program, my MFA. And so, in a lot of ways, I was experiencing sort of a lot of the kinds of firsts and upheavals that are maybe sort of particular to adolescence, and was sort of absorbing everything new around me and also feeling really unmoored. And so, sort of was very much in the state of a mind of an adolescent, actually. Um, and was compelled to go back to that period, I think, for some of the same reasons that Melissa discussed. I think a lot had happened that I hadn't processed. And sort of in this kind of adolescent renaissance period, I was thinking, oh, maybe it's time to sort of take a look back, and get some clarity before I kind of move forward into adulthood a second time.
Yeah, I really like the idea of sort of that upheaval and connection too to adolescence. And Lily, it's your question, but you're still welcome to answer it.
Yeah. I originally had no intention of writing any of the stuff that ended up in the book about my adolescence and early teen years, and actually added all of that after conversations with Melissa. So thank you. But realizing that there were these big gaps in the story that I needed to fill, and when I started trying to write about that time, I had that same feeling. I was like, I don't really remember that time. I remember feelings and flashes and smells, but like I couldn't wrap my head around it enough to feel like I could tell a coherent story about it. So I did a lot of looking at photos and reading old notebooks. I had journals too, but most of them were not very personal. It was like funny quotes that my friends said, and like budgets when I was living on my own for the first time, and not a lot of deep stuff in there, but a couple clues. And filling in that story in the context of this larger story I was telling about my father and about how his death shaped my life made a lot of things click into place for the first time. For a long time, as we so often do, I had believed the story about myself that had been told back to me, and I remembered myself as the wild, out of control, hellion, troublemaker teenager that other people saw. And, I very much was that, but writing about that time and making the connection on paper to how soon that was after my father's death, and moving back to New York and starting high school, and all of this upheaval that was going on in my life, it all made more sense to me all of a sudden. And I started realizing like, oh, I was doing all of that because I was terrified and hurting, and it was a lot of it was a process of finding compassion for that version of myself that I had just created this kind of funny, ridiculous caricature of, and she was a person to tell wild stories about, but, writing that version of myself as a real character and finding compassion for her and understanding why I did all the things I did, it was intense. So.
Yeah, I think that's actually like a perfect segue into Forsyth's question, where you noted that there's a commonality between the books about growing up female and addiction. Do you all sense a kind of connection or some sort of I don't know, interchange there that had to be addressed in your writing?
I can speak to to my sort of personal, I'm not sure if that's exactly what you meant by the question, Forsyth, but these things are totally inextricable in my life and in my treatment of my life and in writing. And one of the ways that I've come to understand my own addiction, is, and this is one of those stories that I've had to rewrite, and like Lilly, I sort of had a kind of quippy, dismissive line about a shtick about it, until I wrote about it, and I've written about it in all of my books. But I definitely see my experience of addiction both as sort of like a genetic disease, but also as a means of survival, and primarily like as a means of surviving the sort of unspeakable burdens and corners of what I associated with being female, and the ways that that felt impossible to name and impossible to sort of move through without some kind of armor. And for me, drugs and alcohol were the most effective armor until they were the worst armor, the most ineffective armor, So for me, I think because the nature of my work is such that it starts with like a single strand and then starts to pull in the other related strands, I almost always end up twining together, or maybe teasing apart, however you want to think about it, my experiences of girlhood and my experiences of addiction and my experiences of recovery from both of those experiences.
Yeah, I'll say too, there's a kind of inextricability in the novel. The narrator Allie is a teenager. She's sort of becoming a woman, and as she starts to feel the sort of the burdens associated with that, and at the same time feels an attraction towards another young woman in I think a socio-political context where that's not necessarily a safe thing. She turns to eating disorders and calorie restriction and sort of shrinking her body as a way to sort of kill two birds with one stone, right? And sort of put a stop to all of it simultaneously, and to narrow her world into something much more manageable, than what feels otherwise a bit too chaotic. And she does this together with the title character Justine, and in some ways their friendship is a bonding through addiction and through pain. And Lilly, one of the images in your book that I was so struck by is that one of you, and I'm sorry, I can't remember your friend's name as a teenager. Yeah, like stomping down the streets of the Lower East Side in your big boots and your fishnets and your purple hair, snorting coke all day essentially. And just that image of sort of like the two girls linking arms sort of to each other for dear life, really struck me.
I saw so much of that in Justine too, right? Like in the first like 3 pages, I was like, okay, yeah, I know this story.
I experienced that with both of your books. And that image, in fact, in Lily's book is one of the ones that comes to mind first when I think about her book, is that image. And I think it's just because I identified so much with that young character. And I had the same experience of Justine where I was like, I know her. I know her.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, where substances fit in to the story. I mean, first of all, I think there were just so many layers of self-protective armor that I had to get through to tell this story. I originally wasn't planning on talking about my own substance use at all. I was talking about my parents' addictions, and that is that was story worthy, but my own was, that was nothing, and coming around to realize that, like, of course, obviously that's part of the story, was a big part of it. And the connection to girlhood, I think is a big one too. And for me, it was somewhat of an armor and a numbing, but it was also an excuse. Being high and drunk made it okay to be loud and rambunctious and emotional in a way that I was anyway, but was embarrassed to be without that justification, right? Because if you're just a teenage girl and you have a lot of emotions and you want to yell and scream and cry, then you're dramatic and emotional and hormonal and whatever. But if you're just drunk, then like, oh yeah, she's just, she's just drunk. That's why she's screaming and laughing and crying. And that for some reason was more acceptable in the like social scene that I was part of.
That sort of reminds me a bit of Melissa. Towards the end of your book, you talk about the panopticon and the sort of power of being watched. And I'm curious about, especially whether it's writing a novel or writing yourself as a character, as you were saying, Lily, how you deal with perspective and self-perception, and how these different ways the world views us changes the way that we as individuals interact and move through the world.
That's a really good question. I'm just spinning back through my whole experience of writing to try to track it. I think, in many ways, I will say, with nonfiction, what I'm always trying to do, but particularly what I was trying to do in this book, was expose the sort of multi-tier of mirrors of sort of watching myself and self-consciousness. And there was this whole other kind of element as I was writing these stories and sort of narrating and putting words to and drawing a picture of the ways that I internalized that kind of gaze. Like Foucault was not thinking about me when he was writing Discipline and Punish, but I saw myself all over it when I read about the panopticon, and of course there's many like feminist theorists who have also written about this, but I was also, particularly after I read that text, and started to work it into one of the essays, that I became even more aware of the ways that sort of internalization of sort of self-appraisal and self-disciplining was at work even in the process of writing the book, where there was this voice as I was writing that was saying the whole time, like, no one cares. This has been written about before. You're making a big deal out of nothing, and it was just like exactly the voice that I had already sort of come to recognize. I'm holding it up and imagining it like a little rat or something. And that had made me want to be like, oh, I'm clearly going to write this book because this voice needs to be dug out and smashed under my heel and then burned and buried and then the earth salted over where I have buried it. And yet it was like still talking to me the whole time that I was writing, which in some ways was frustrating and gave me pause and also spurred me on, because it was so clear to me that that work is just never going to be done and that I have to constantly be peeling back those layers and digging it out and salting the earth.
I love that, and I'm gonna imagine that doubt voice as a gross little rat from now on. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, I experienced that too, in a lot of like worrying about what people were gonna think, and worrying about sharing so many personal things, and worrying about if other people who were there were gonna agree with the way I was characterizing things, and just having to work so hard to shove all of that out of the way. But I tried to actively engage with and use perception and, these kind of archetypes and images that people think they know, and a couple times with myself and also with my parents, the junkie artist and the like iconoclastic, like wild stripper chick, and, the teenage delinquent, and, give people these images that they think they know, and then lift up the rock and show all the other stuff that's under there, and show all of the humanity and complexity and layers there. And I just, always was coming up against this idea of how much more there is to it, and how many things can be true at once, and how little about a person you know by putting them into a category that you think is familiar to you.
Well, I think we should jump into the Q&A, make sure our audience gets a chance to ask their questions. So if you do have a question, please make sure you post it in the Q&A. We'll try and get to as many as possible. So let's start with what artist or work from any other discipline has inspired your writing? Forsyth, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I was really inspired by Daniel Klaus's graphic novel Ghost World. I probably read it, 10 years before I started this project, but it is an illustrated narrative that features two young women with a complicated but unexamined relationship that winds up being completely unresolved in the end. And that book, also sort of episodic, and a bit withheld, showed me that telling that kind of story in that sort of format was possible. And so I held that close for several years until I was ready to approach my own project, and took a lot of confidence from it.
I can go. Usually when I'm asked about influences, the first thing I go to is Anais Nin, because her diaries were what made me realize that I could write about my own life. But I decided instead to talk about music, because you said any genre, so I don't want to give you another writer. And was thinking about my favorite band, L7. Which if you don't know them, you should check them out. They're an all-girl grunge band from LA in the 90s that Nirvana was a big fan of. And just the feeling, I was really, really into them when I was a teenager. But still, whenever I hear their music, I just get this just excited, and it makes me angry and happy and want to scream and dance. And I just was trying to maintain that level of emotion and energy in words as well.
That's so great. Oh, I forgot about Ghost World. I was so obsessed. Yeah, it makes me want to go back and read it again. I've got to find a way to fit 100 artists into this, and I think I'm going to basically go with music too, because it really, as much as I was obsessed with reading and really sort of often joke, although it's completely true, that reading was my first drug of choice, because it really was. I did it the same way I did every other drug. But music was, and you could, I think I referenced this in the passage that I read, there was a way music offered this kind of cathartic, artistic, emotional experience for me early. Books took me out of myself, which was a huge relief, but music created a container and an outlet for my emotional reality in ways that didn't feel safe in any other place. I remember listening to as a teenager, PJ Harvey's "Oh My Lover," very specific sort of beat track song. But it was just again, like Lily said, I wanted to scream and moan and cry and laugh all at the same time. And yet I had already long committed to a facade of emotionlessness. And so it was through music that I could sort of vicariously experience those. And I think also it was really music that I was oh, art can be like an arrow that pierces you and makes you fly open, and everything that you've been carrying can come out, and I'm still jealous of musicians. And I think I've taken a lot from my experience of listening to particularly sort of feminist punk music of the 90s, but also soul music of the 60s. And the ways that those are my favorite sort of emoting portholes. And I can see the ways that my experience of absorbing those forms of art has been sort of grafted onto the way that I relate to writing, and I would definitely say that sort of riot girl music and zine culture and those sort of forms of political action, girl community art and emotionality, provided a kind of map to me as an artist when I was really young.
Amazing. there's a question from an audience member that I feel like I never really hear it asked a lot of writers, because so much of the conversation is about like the struggle of writing and the doubt, and Melissa, the rat you picked up. Um, uh, so were there moments of particular joy in creating your books?
I'm gonna jump in because it doesn't look like anybody else is going to, and I'll keep it short. I just like writing is really hard. But I love it. I find it really fun. I find it like as a really consistent source of joy. Usually after I've written like that, like is it Twain or whoever says I enjoy having written but not writing. But I also enjoy writing. Like it is a form of self-forgetting by which I get to move closer to myself. And I don't know anything else. TV doesn't do that. Like candy doesn't do that for me. Most forms of self-forgetting estrange me from myself, and writing does. And this book in particular brought me home to so many estranged parts of myself. Like it is a joy that I get to take with me for the rest of my life.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this process was hard and frustrating and sad and lonely and all of those things, but a lot of it was very joyful too. And the moments where I was just like so far in it that I became like mad scientist, and just like taping pages. At one point I like printed out the whole thing and cut it up and covered like all the walls in the long hallway and living room, and then texted my husband. It was like, sorry, made a little bit of a mess. It'll only be there for a couple days. But, and then just like walking up and down the hallway and moving pages around and muttering to myself and like looking like I was totally out of my mind, but just so in the zone and making connections and feeling like I was gonna get there, and it was so close and it almost is working, and yes, that does go there, and oh my God, look, that leads into that. And just that excitement, I don't find that level of thrill anywhere else.
Yeah, I'll say too, that I've been really grateful for like the particular pleasure of moving between writing and illustration, which for me are really different. Like the writing is more of an exertion, and there are kind of highs that come with that exertion, um, and lows. Whereas for me, the process of illustration is a bit more like of a time to integrate those highs and lows. It's more passive, and sort of a time to allow the dust to settle. And there's a kind of peace in the process of illustration that I find balances out sometimes the heavier lifting of writing, and peace may be the greatest joy.
That's such a nice way to put that. So when you're writing about life events, how important is it for you to have temporal distance to transform, as Gornick would say, situation to story? And that can apply to memoir or also like a fictionalized version of something that maybe reflects your own life.
Oh, I'll talk about that. Maybe. Yeah, Justine is definitely an autobiographical novel, and I saw someone else in the comments ask, did I grow up on Long Island? Yes, I did. How much of the novel is autobiographical? Lots of it. But it was important for me to create a kind of character who sort of was like me but wasn't me, and a set of experiences that embodied my emotional journey but not necessarily my situational journey. I was, as I'm sure many of you here tonight are, inspired by the title essay of Alexandra Chee's How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, which addresses this particular question far more eloquently than I ever could. But I think the sum of it is, writing fiction allowed me to sort of pull something out of myself, and change it just enough so that I could recognize it as being separate from myself. And that was sort of what allowed me to tell the story that I felt was truer to my emotional experience than the details of my actual life.
You go ahead, Lily.
I think there sometimes can be great value and immediacy to writing while you're in the thick of an experience, and I don't subscribe to the hard and fast rule that you need to have processed something in order to write about it. I think if that was the case, I would never have written anything. So writing is how I make sense of things and process them. But for me, there are different kinds of writing, and sometimes maybe can't coexist exactly in the same piece. When I first went to add more of like personal storyline to this book, I wrote like almost up to the present in which I was writing, because I wasn't sure yet what was going to fit, and I was just throwing spaghetti at the wall, and then I ended up cutting like 5 years off of that storyline, because all the most recent stuff was stuff I was still very much in the midst of, and I had a lot of emotions about it, but I didn't have a whole lot to say about it yet, and I hadn't yet made a lot of meaning out of it, and so it felt discordant with the rest of the storyline where I had that distance to make meaning and reflect, and it just kind of, it felt like it went to mush at the end, so I had to cut all that off, but I saved it, and then maybe now that's now several years ago again, so maybe now I'll go back and make something out of it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add that Lily didn't say and that Forsyth didn't say, but I often write my way through experiences and write my way out of experiences, because writing is the primary mode of my any good thinking that I am capable of. Like, none of it has happened locked in here. I will say this, and I'm going to try to not get to like craft teachery, because this is something I talk about with my students a lot, but I will say that I've observed in hindsight that the stories where the primary timeline was a very present one, my second book, Abandon Me, I had to stop writing that book like after Act 2, because I had to go live Act 3, and I didn't yet know. I thought I knew, but I didn't actually know how that was going to end. But I will say that I've come to understand, looking back at that book in particular, that it matters where the sort of frame of the story is. Like, that story didn't begin where that timeline started. It began like way back in my childhood. And that present timeline was sort of an answer to things that I had been sitting with and mulling with and having an evolving relationship to for many years. And so it's rare that something will be that I'll write something in the present as it's happening, and that will be the only thing in the writing. It's almost always folded in, as Lily's saying, with artifacts of memory that I have a lot more perspective on, and it's never that draft that I wrote while it was happening. Like, I always go back and have to add the other facets of the prism to it, but I do feel very strongly that when people say you can't write things in the middle of the experience, that's never been my experience. And in fact, because I have a terrible memory, I'm often racing against it. So if I want to write about something with any kind of like real immediacy, I need to take copious notes, which I usually do, or I need to write about it while it's happening.
I think we have time for just one more question, if that's all right with you all. So I'm going to try and make it one that's sort of more general, so that you can all weigh in. So one that I think might be interesting is, as writers, what's more important to you, asking a question or making a statement, or, and I'll add, or something else?
I would say that I don't get to the statement without the question. I don't, if I already know something and I already know exactly what I think about it, I don't need to write about it. Like, why would I go through all of the work if I already know what the answer is? I'll just tweet it or like talk about it a lot. Or maybe like an op-ed, but not even. I can't, writing is hard, and it has to be like the fire that that runs it is my own inquisitiveness, my own curiosity about what I actually think about things. So it starts with a question, and then it ends up often with a kind of grand statement that my partner makes fun of me about a lot. But I would never get there if I didn't have a question first.
Yeah, that's right. One doesn't put oneself through this without, the desperate need to figure something out. It's not always an externally rewarding pursuit, right? So if there isn't, something else to be gained or found in the process, I don't think we would do it.
Yeah, I completely agree with what both of you have said. For me, it's a question that is like kind of impossible to answer, but that I can try to answer. That's what excites me enough to want to write about it. And yeah, if I had a statement, I think that's perfect. Yeah, if it's a statement, then it probably only needs to be a sentence or a couple, maybe a paragraph at most. But I guess this also, speaking of, a moment of joy in the process of writing, one of the most exciting moments for me was when I found something that my father had written in a letter to his sister that happened to perfectly describe what I was trying to do in the writing of the book. And it made me feel like I was doing it right. And it's something that I've held on to and come back to a lot. And he was writing about, discovering Judaism and, starting to go to synagogue for the first time in his life and comparing that to what it's like to be an artist. And he described, he said, no answers, but a sharpening and deepening of the questions. It's like, yes, that. and that, so that has become something that I think about a lot in the writing process. And when I'm frustrated with myself for not being able to come to this statement at the end, I ask, well, are you at least sharpening and deepening the questions?
That's so beautiful, Lily.
So beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. Such a wise and inspiring note to end on as well. So Lily, Melissa, Forsyth, thank you all for joining us tonight and sharing your wisdom with us and sharing your books and your artwork. Also, Josh, my colleague, thank you for producing things behind the scenes. And thank you to everyone who joined us from across the social distance to celebrate these exceptional books, which are available for pre-order or at purchase at your local indie bookshop. If you haven't already, please sign up for our email list and subscribe to our print quarterly at bombmagazine.org. And we hope you'll join us again on June 15th for the launch of Jonathan Lee's forthcoming novel, The Great Mistake. Until then, please stay safe and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So nice to see you.
Love you too. Thanks, Ben.